What is the scariest story you know that is 1000% true? Story 1. So this happened when I was helping my uncle clean out his late neighbor's house. The old guy had lived alone for like 30 years, super quiet, never caused trouble. We're going through the basement and I find this locked room behind some shelves. Uncle says he's never seen it before. We break the lock and holy crap. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with newspaper clippings about missing kids from the 72nd and 82nd. All organized by date, with red circles around certain words. There had to be hundreds of them. And in the corner was this chair facing the wall with rope tied to the arms. We called the cops immediately and got out of there. Turns out the guy had been investigated back in the day but nothing was ever proven. Still gives me chills thinking about what might have happened in that room. Story 2. This is probably the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me, and I didn't even realize it until afterward. I was maybe 19, working the night shift at a convenience store in a pretty rough part of town. It was one of those 24-hour places that attracted all kinds of interesting characters after midnight. So I'm there around 2 a.m., completely dead store, just me reading a magazine behind the counter. This guy walks in, average-looking dude, maybe 32nd, wearing a hoodie. He wanders around for a while, picks up some snacks, comes to the counter. Normal transaction, pays cash, leaves. I thought nothing of it. About an hour later, this police car pulls up outside with its lights flashing. 2 officers come in asking if I'm okay, if anything weird happened, if I noticed anyone suspicious. I'm like, no, everything's been totally normal. They ask me to describe anyone who came in recently, so I tell them about hoodie guy. Turns out this same guy had just hit 3 other stores in the area over the past 2 hours. But here's the terrifying part, he wasn't robbing them. He was walking in, looking around, and then attacking the clerks with a knife. 2 people were in the hospital, 1 in critical condition. The cops showed me his picture and it was definitely the same guy. They figured he must have seen something that spooked him at my store, or maybe I just got lucky with timing. But when I thought back to our interaction, there was nothing weird about it at all. He seemed completely normal, even polite. I quit that job the next week. The whole thing really messed with my head, you know? Like, I was probably 30 seconds away from being stabbed by some random psycho, and I was just sitting there reading about celebrity gossip completely clueless. The manager said they'd had problems before but never told any of us night shift workers. Sometimes I wonder what it was that made him leave my store alone. Maybe he saw the security camera, or heard something outside. I'll never know, but man, I'm grateful for whatever it was. Story 3. When I was 16, I worked at a small grocery store in our tiny town. There was this regular customer, Mr. Patterson, who came in every Tuesday and Friday like clockwork. Super polite, always bought the exact same things: bread, milk, canned soup, and cat food. He'd chat about the weather and ask how school was going. One Friday he didn't show up, which was weird because this guy was more reliable than the mail. The next Tuesday, still nothing. By the following Friday, our manager was actually worried because Mr. Patterson had been coming in for literally years without missing a day. The police did a wellness check and found him in his kitchen. He'd had a heart attack, probably been gone for over a week. But here's where it gets absolutely terrifying. When they were processing the scene, they found something that made them call in state investigators. His basement had been converted into what could only be described as a shrine. There were dozens of photos of women and girls from our town, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Pictures of them grocery shopping, at the school pickup line, walking their dogs. Some of the photos went back decades based on the clothing and cars in the background. But the worst part was the journals. Pages and pages of detailed observations about their daily routines, what time they left for work, when their husbands traveled, which windows in their houses didn't have curtains. He had been watching and documenting the lives of women in our town for at least 20 years. The police contacted everyone they could identify in the photos. My mom was in there, pictures of her from when I was little, notes about what days she worked late. Several of my teachers, classmates' mothers, basically any woman he'd ever encountered. They never found any evidence that he'd actually hurt anyone or broken into homes, but knowing that this sweet old man who asked about my algebra tests had been secretly stalking half the women in town, that completely changed how I look at people. You really never know what's going on behind someone's friendly face. The grocery store had to get counseling resources for employees because we all felt so violated and scared. Story 4. This happened in my hometown in the 92nd when I was in middle school. There was this family, the Hendersons, who lived on the edge of town in this old farmhouse. The dad worked at the lumber mill, mom was a substitute teacher, and they had 3 kids. Everything seemed totally normal until one day the oldest son, Tommy, just didn't show up to school. Then the next day, the middle kid was absent too. By the 3rd day, people started asking questions because none of the family was answering their phone. My dad was a volunteer firefighter, So he went with the sheriff to do a welfare check. What they found still haunts our whole community. The mom was sitting at the kitchen table, dressed like she was going to church, but she'd been gone for at least a week. The two younger kids were in their beds, tucked in like they were just sleeping. Tommy was in the barn, and that's where it gets really disturbing. Apparently he'd been taking care of everyone after they passed, keeping them clean, talking to them, even trying to feed them. The investigators said he'd been living like that for almost 2 weeks, completely convinced his family was just sick and would get better. The worst part? People in town had noticed the smell but just assumed it was something dead on their property, like a deer or something. Nobody thought to check on them because the Hendersons kept to themselves anyway. Tommy got sent to a facility for help, and honestly, I hope he's doing okay now. But driving past that empty farmhouse on the way to school every day was terrifying. The windows were all boarded up, but you could still see the outline of where their garden used to be. It made everyone in town realize how isolated some families really are, and how mental health problems can make people do things that seem impossible to understand. Sometimes being a good neighbor means checking on people even when everything looks fine from the outside. Story 5. The entrance was this concrete pipe, maybe 4 feet across, that went straight down about 10 feet before leveling off. Easy enough to climb down with the ladder rungs they had built in. The main tunnel was awesome, like 8 feet high and wide enough for both of us to walk side by side. We're having a blast, feeling like real explorers. But then we find this side passage that slopes downward. It starts off big enough to walk through but gets smaller as it goes. Being the brilliant teenagers we were, we decide to see how far it goes. I'm in front, and after maybe 50 feet I have to start crawling. Then army crawling. Then basically squirming on my belly. That's when I realize I screwed up. The tunnel keeps going down but I can't turn around. There's not enough room. I try to back up but my shirt gets caught on something and I'm basically stuck. I start to panic, which makes everything worse because now I'm breathing hard and feeling like the walls are closing in. My friend is behind me yelling, asking what's wrong, and I'm trying to stay calm, but honestly I'm terrifying myself thinking about what happens if I can't get out. What if I'm stuck here forever? What if it rains and this thing floods? What if my friend leaves to get help and can't find me again? I managed to rip my shirt free and wiggle backwards, inch by inch, but it took probably an hour to get back to where I could turn around. By the time we got out of there I was covered in mud and completely exhausted. Never went exploring underground again. Just thinking about being trapped like that still makes my heart race. Story 6. I used to work offshore on drilling rigs, and man, the stuff you see out there still keeps me up at night. This one time, we had a blowout during a routine operation. Nothing too crazy at first, but then the emergency systems totally failed. 3 of our crew got trapped in the lower compartment when the blast doors sealed automatically. We could hear them banging on the metal, shouting that they were okay but needed help getting out. The thing is, our company rep made the call that opening those doors would compromise the integrity of the operation. So we're all standing there, listening to our friends calling for help, and this guy in a suit is telling us we can't do anything. Said something about insurance liability and how rescuing them could make things worse. Complete garbage, but what are you gonna do when corporate lawyers are involved? Those guys lasted about 6 hours before it went quiet. The crazy part is, when investigators finally got down there weeks later, they found the doors could have been opened manually the whole time. Just needed someone with the right access codes, which the company rep had but refused to use. The family sued, but you know how that goes with big oil companies. Somehow it all got swept under the rug. I heard the rep got transferred to a desk job with a promotion. Meanwhile, 3 good men lost their lives because some pencil pusher decided profits were more important than people. Story 7. I work as a librarian, and a few years ago I got assigned to help digitize some historical testimony collection. Thought it would be pretty routine stuff, maybe some oral histories from WWI veterans or civil rights activists. Turned out to be testimonies from survivors of the Rwandan genocide. My job was basically to organize and catalog these video interviews and written statements. I figured I'd just skim through them to get the basic info for the database entries. Big mistake. The first one I opened was from this woman talking about how she and 7 other people hid in a tiny bathroom for weeks. She described every detail, how they couldn't flush the toilet except when someone else in the house was running water, how they took turns sleeping because there wasn't room for everyone to lie down, how they could hear people outside talking about who they were looking for. But the worst part was how normal she sounded talking about it, like she was describing her morning routine or something. No dramatic crying or anything, just this calm, matter-of-fact voice explaining how she lost 40 pounds and listened to her neighbors planning to kill her family. I ended up having to take a break after the first week because I wasn't sleeping. My supervisor told me that everyone who works on this project goes through the same thing. She said there's an understanding that you're going to be affected by this material, and that's just part of the job. What really got to me was reading about how quickly everything changed. People would describe their normal life one day, going to school, working their jobs, hanging out with friends, and then the next day those same friends were part of groups hunting them down. I finished the project because I felt like I owed it to these people to get their stories properly archived, but I requested to work on different collections after that. Some things just stick with you, you know? It changed how I think about how quickly society can just break down. Story 8. So this happened when I was in college. I had this professor for my African studies class who seemed pretty normal, older guy, always wore these thick glasses, super quiet speaking voice. About halfway through the semester we're covering modern conflicts and he starts talking about Rwanda in the 92nd. He's going through the basic timeline stuff when suddenly he just stops mid-sentence and stares at his notes for like 30 seconds. The whole class goes dead silent. Then he looks up and says I was there. I was working for an NGO when it started. For the next hour he told us things that I still can't get out of my head. How normal everything seemed right before it happened. People going to work, kids playing, neighbors chatting. Then within days, those same neighbors were hunting each other with farming tools. He talked about hiding in a colleague's house, listening to the sounds outside, not knowing if the people looking for them were friends or enemies anymore. The part that really messed me up was when he described how quickly regular people just switched, like a flip was turned. He said you could see it in their eyes. One day they'd wave hello, the next day they'd cross the street to avoid you, and by the third day they might be in a group outside your house. He never talked about it again for the rest of the semester. But man, the way his hands were shaking when he told us. You could tell he was right back there in his head. Sometimes the scariest stories are the ones about how fast everything normal can just disappear. Story 9. My mom's brother started acting really strange after their dad passed away. Uncle Mike had always been a little off, but after the funeral he became obsessed with talking to dead people. He'd sit in Grandpa's old chair for hours having full conversations with empty air. At first we thought it was just grief, you know? But then he started leaving food out for Grandpa, setting extra places at dinner, that kind of stuff. Mom was worried but figured he'd snap out of it eventually. The breaking point came when I was staying over at his place. Around 2 a.m. I woke up to him yelling downstairs. I crept to the top of the stairs and saw him standing in the living room, screaming at someone who wasn't there. He was saying things like I'm sorry, I should have visited more and please don't hurt me. But here's the really messed up part. He was holding a knife and making stabbing motions at the air. Like he was defending himself from something only he could see. I quietly called my mom and we got him to a hospital the next morning. Turns out he'd been having a complete mental breakdown and was hallucinating attacks from our dead grandfather. The doctors said if it had gone on much longer, he might have seriously hurt himself or someone else thinking he was protecting himself from ghosts. He's doing better now with medication, but man, seeing someone you love completely lose touch with reality like that? That's scarier than any horror movie. Mental illness is no joke. Story 10. Growing up, everyone in my family had these weird health problems that doctors could never really explain. My little sister was born with a heart defect. My dad developed this rare skin condition in his 30s. I had constant respiratory issues as a kid that just mysteriously went away when I moved to college. We lived about 2 miles from this big pharmaceutical plant that had been there since the 1952nd. Beautiful place actually, they had these manicured lawns and everything looked super clean and professional from the outside. My dad even worked there for a few years in the 82nd. Fast forward to 2019, and I'm working as a journalist covering environmental stuff. I'm researching water contamination for a completely different story when I stumble across some old EPA documents about groundwater testing in my hometown. Turns out that plant had been illegally dumping chemical waste into the local water system for over 40 years. The documents were insane. They showed contamination levels that were literally hundreds of times higher than what's considered safe. The company knew about it the entire time and had been falsifying their environmental reports to regulators. But here's the really messed up part. The EPA had known since 1995. They'd been quietly negotiating with the company for decades, trying to work out some kind of settlement. Meanwhile, thousands of families were drinking poisoned water every single day. The plant finally got shut down in 2018, but only because the company moved operations overseas. They never admitted wrongdoing, never paid for anyone's medical bills, never even apologized. I ended up writing a series about it that got picked up by some bigger news outlets. Within 6 months, we had over 300 families come forward with similar health issues. A law firm is now handling a class action lawsuit, but honestly, most of the evidence has been lost and the statute of limitations has expired on a lot of the worst stuff. My sister still has heart problems. My dad's skin condition never went away. And every time I drink tap water anywhere, I can't help but wonder what else is being hidden from us. It's terrifying how easily corporations can just poison entire communities and face basically no consequences. Story 11. I spent 3 years working for the county health department thinking I was protecting public health. Turns out I was just helping rich people avoid consequences for poisoning communities. We had this industrial area where several factories dumped waste. The groundwater testing showed contamination levels that were completely off the charts, stuff that causes cancer, birth defects, you name it. My job was to write the reports recommending cleanup and penalties. I submitted my first report calling for immediate action and massive fines. My supervisor handed it back covered in red ink, saying I'd misinterpreted the data. When I pushed back with scientific studies backing up my conclusions, she scheduled me for additional training on proper data analysis. The training was basically learning how to write reports that technically followed regulations while downplaying any actual health risks. They taught me to use phrases like within acceptable parameters and requires further study instead of saying this will give people cancer. Meanwhile, I'm living in the same county as these contaminated areas. My neighbors, my friends, their kids are drinking this water and breathing this air. I'd go to barbecues on weekends and watch little kids playing in yards that I knew were toxic, but I couldn't say anything because of confidentiality agreements. The breaking point was when my own nephew started getting nosebleeds every day. His family lived 2 miles from the worst contamination site. I ran private tests on their well water and found levels that should have triggered an evacuation. But according to our adjusted public reports, everything was fine. I tried going to the media with copies of my original reports. Within a week, I was suspended for unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information. They fired me a month later and threatened legal action if I ever spoke publicly about anything I'd seen. The factories are still operating. The contamination is still there, probably worse now. My nephew's family moved away when they could afford to, but most people in that area can't. They're stuck drinking poison water because people like my old boss decided corporate profits mattered more than human lives. I have nightmares about those kids playing in toxic dirt. That's the scariest true story I know. Story 12. What really gets to me is how recent this stuff happens. This isn't some ancient history, this was happening when I was in high school. My neighbor worked at a chemical plant just outside our town from 2008 to 2015. The plant made coatings for food packaging, and they told all the workers that everything they handled was food safe, obviously, since it would be touching food. The workers weren't given any special protective equipment beyond basic safety glasses. My neighbor, Dave, used to joke about how his work clothes would repel water after his shifts, like the chemicals made them waterproof. He thought it was awesome and would demonstrate by pouring water on his sleeve and watching it bead up and roll off. Management actively encouraged this attitude. They had company picnics where they'd spray the stuff on paper plates to show how safe it was. The plant manager even drank from a cup coated with their product during safety meetings to prove there was nothing to worry about. Workers were told the chemicals were less toxic than dish soap. Dave started having weird health issues around 2012. Constant fatigue, joint pain, memory problems. Multiple doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. Then in 2016, a whistleblower from the plant came forward with internal documents showing the company knew their chemicals caused organ damage and immune system problems. They'd been tracking employee health issues for years and hiding the data. The documents showed they knew workers were being exposed to dangerous levels of toxic substances daily. They calculated the cost of proper safety equipment versus potential lawsuit settlements and decided it was cheaper to just deal with the lawsuits later. They even had a budget line item for employee health liability. Dave ended up with permanent kidney damage. He's on dialysis now and will probably need a transplant. The company settled out of court for an amount that doesn't even cover his medical bills. They renamed the chemical compound slightly and moved production to a different state where they're probably doing the exact same thing to new workers right now. The plant manager who used to drink from those coated cups? He never worked in the actual production area. He knew exactly what he was doing. Story 13. So this happened when I was helping my uncle clean out his late neighbor's house. The old guy had lived alone for like 30 years, super quiet, never caused trouble. We're going through the basement and I find this locked room behind some shelves. Uncle says he's never seen it before. Found out something absolutely horrifying about my family last year when my grandmother was in the hospital. She was on some heavy pain medication and started talking about stuff from when she was young that she'd never mentioned before. She kept going on about how her older brother had to go away when she was like 8 years old. I figured she meant he went to boarding school or something, but when I asked my aunt about it later, her face went completely white. Turns out my great-uncle had some serious mental health issues that the family just couldn't handle back in the 1942nd. But here's the really messed up part. Before they finally got him help, he did something to their neighbor's dog that was so disturbing the whole neighborhood wanted him gone. My aunt wouldn't tell me the details, but she said it involved the family finding pieces around their yard and that my great-uncle was convinced the dog was speaking to him. The authorities were called, but back then, they didn't really know how to deal with mental illness properly. What really freaks me out is that my aunt said he seemed totally normal most of the time. He'd help with chores, play with the other kids, be completely fine. But then he'd have these episodes where he'd become someone completely different. He spent the rest of his life in an institution, and the family never talked about him again. Finding out that level of mental illness runs in my family, and that it can make someone do such horrible things while seeming perfectly normal otherwise? That keeps me up at night sometimes. Story 14. This happened to my dad back in the 72nd, but he only told me about it recently, and it's been keeping me up at night ever since. He was working as a security guard at this chemical plant, doing the overnight shift. Pretty boring job mostly, just walking around checking that doors were locked, making sure equipment was running normal. So he's doing his usual rounds around 3 a.m. when he notices the door to one of the storage areas is propped open. This was weird because those doors were supposed to stay locked at all times. He goes to investigate and finds this guy inside messing around with some equipment he definitely shouldn't have been touching. My dad approaches the guy and asks what he's doing there. The guy spins around and he's got this totally wild look in his eyes, sweating like crazy even though it was pretty cold that night. He starts rambling about how the company screwed him over, how they fired him for no reason, how he's going to show them what happened. Now, my dad was always pretty good at talking to people, so he just started chatting with this guy, acting all casual. Asked him his name, what happened with his job, that kind of thing. After maybe 20 minutes of talking, the guy seemed to calm down a bit and my dad convinced him to leave. Here's the part that really gets me though. Dad found out later that this storage area contained chemicals that, if mixed wrong, could have created some seriously toxic gas. Like, enough to take out half the plant and probably a good chunk of the surrounding neighborhood. The guy knew exactly what he was doing. My dad never reported it because he felt bad for the guy, figured he was just having a rough time and didn't really mean any harm. But thinking about it now, with everything that's happened in the world since then, that was probably way more dangerous than he realized at the time. Sometimes I wonder how many disasters get prevented by pure luck and people just being decent to each other. Story 15. Found out something absolutely horrifying about my family last year when my grandmother was in the hospital. She was on some heavy pain medication and started talking about stuff from when she was young that she'd never mentioned before. She kept going on about how her older brother had to go away when she was like 8 years old. I figured she meant he went to boarding school or something, but when I asked my aunt about it later, her face went completely white. Turns out my great uncle had some serious mental health issues that the family just couldn't handle back in the 1942nd. But here's the really messed up part. Before they finally got him help, he did something to their neighbor's dog that was so disturbing the whole neighborhood wanted him gone. My aunt wouldn't tell me the details, but she said it involved the family finding pieces around their yard and that my great uncle was convinced the dog was speaking to him. The authorities were called, but back then, they didn't really know how to deal with mental illness properly. What really freaks me out is that my aunt said he seemed totally normal most of the time. He'd help with chores, play with the other kids, be completely fine. But then he'd have these episodes where he'd become someone completely different. He spent the rest of his life in an institution, and the family never talked about him again. Finding out that level of mental illness runs in my family, and that it can make someone do such horrible things while seeming perfectly normal otherwise? That keeps me up at night sometimes.